talking?
So today I wanted to discuss two of my favorite consoles of all time, the original Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Basically, I wanted to discuss the actual consoles themselves, not their games, not which is my favorite, which is my least favorite. I think they were both excellent consoles. I want to have a look at both of them and break them down so that we can discover on a logical level which one of these two consoles was the superior one. If they were both available today, which one would we buy? Let's have a look at both of them. Let's have a look firstly at the Sony PlayStation. Okay, so the Sony PlayStation, let's have a look at the good things about it. I always like to start things on a good note. Now, firstly was the fact that the Sony PlayStation came with the CD. The games came on a CD, and that gave a huge advantage to developers. One, CDs are a lot cheaper to manufacture compared to, say, a game cartridge. Now, you want to attract developers. The more developers you can get, the more games you get, better quality. It's a bit of a win-win for both sides. Now, another advantage which CDs bring, other than being cheap to produce, is their storage space. Your typical CD will have roughly, say, 700 megabytes of space for developers to work with. That was. Nowadays, it's really nothing, but that was a lot of room for developers to play around with, which let us introduce two things into gaming which during the 8-bit, 16-bit, 24-bit and so forth era, the previous consoles, we didn't have the honor of enjoying, because quite frankly you couldn't fit that onto a cartridge. Now, one of those things which you got with the extra space was you could have better quality music. Good quality music takes up a lot of space. It really wasn't an option previously, and that's why you had those those really gamey sounds, which, to be honest, they're very nostalgic. I absolutely love those sounds, but you weren't getting proper good quality music. Now, CDs changed that. It didn't really matter how much space they took up. On the PlayStation, you definitely got good sounds. Another thing which CDs brought into the situation was fully rendered cutscenes. Now, this was really appreciated, especially in games which were story driven. It would let you be more immersed. You'd play your game with the typical polygons, low-res textures. It was the beginning of 3D, so we didn't have high expectations to begin with, to be honest. And every once in a while, your fully rendered 3D cutscene would kick in, and they just looked awesome. Like back then, you would actually look forward to it every time one of those cutscenes kicked in. Now, as another result of these CDs, which brought in all the developers, meant that we had a huge flux of games. Like, we had a crazy amount of games. I'm quite glad I wasn't an adult during that era, because I would have spent all of my money buying games. Whenever you bought the PlayStation magazine, there was always previews for a game coming out next month. You had countless games coming out, and those of you old enough to have been around during that era to play these games, you would have countless favorites. Definitely produced a lot of good games. And also, we got more mature games. Now, when things went from 2D to 3D, granted we had a select few mature rated games for 2D, but it was quite limited. Come the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, but mostly the PlayStation, mature games were just that. They were darker, they were grittier, they were bloodier, they were more violent, and we loved it. If you wanted the gritty version of games, if you wanted a game console that would have decapitation, blood, this and that, go on a rampage shooting people, whatever, the PlayStation 1 provided. And also it gave it a good image. The older gamers and the younger ones, granted, we saw this cool looking CD-based console, which also worked as a CD player for music, had all these mature games. We thought, oh, cool, let's give this a shot. Now, unfortunately, we can't discuss only the good things, as much of a fan I am of this system. There is some negatives to it, so let's have a look at them as well, and then straight after we'll have a look at the Nintendo 64, the pros and the cons. Now, unfortunately, Sony's first gaming console did come with quite a few cons compared to its competitor at the very least. Now, firstly, the PlayStation 2 console came with 2 controller ports, which meant that you could play with a friend, 1 or 2 players. Now, if you wanted to play a 3-player game or a 4-player game, so you have a copy of the latest FIFA game, you wanted to play with 3 or 4 of your buddies. Now, unfortunately, there's nowhere to actually plug in those extra controllers. So for the PlayStation, this is a negative. We had to go out and buy an attachment. Now, that's just obviously quite annoying that you had to go and spend more money to get that attachment. Now, moving on, there is some more negatives, unfortunately. Now, if you wanted to save your progress, so you're playing a game and you wanted to save, you had to save it on a memory card. So you had to go out, buy a memory card, and save it. Now, this created quite a few problems. One, obviously you had to spend more money to get these memory cards, and often within the PlayStation cycle, you definitely went through, a few of them. You had to buy them, get bigger versions. But what the issue is, which this caused, was these memory cards could get corrupted. So this was a very, very scary situation. As you can imagine, you're a gamer, you invested countless hours into these fantastic Sony PlayStation games, and you try to load up your game. It doesn't work. You try to load up your other games, it doesn't work. For reasons beyond your power, and you'll never know why, your memory card has failed. Your memory card held, from memory, 12, 15 game slots. They were all gone. All of a sudden, even if you still had the games, your memory card's gone, it's been corrupted, you can't play those games anymore. Well, you can't load the files, you have to start from scratch. Obviously, that's a bit of a kick in the groin, but you had to deal with it. Alright, so moving on to another point. Now, as fantastic as CDs are, and they really were a step up, they did come with their own negatives. And these negatives are actually the reason why Nintendo did not want to do the 64 with CDs and backed out of that deal with Sony. For those of you that weren't aware, Nintendo and Sony were collaborating, and we're going to have a Nintendo system with CDs. Nintendo, for their own reasons, backed out the last moment, and then Sony went ahead to do their own thing. So in return, Nintendo actually created their competitor. Ironic, but it's true, it's history. Look it up, Google it, people. Now, anyways, unfortunately, even though CDs came with all these advantages and all this extra room, and they're cool and they're mighty, they scratch. They can scratch, they get dented. You leave them flat down on a surface, you pick it up, there's a scratch. That would cause skipping, because while the PlayStation is working, obviously the CD is continuously spinning, it's continuously reading. If there's a scratch on it, it makes it jump. If there's enough scratches, the game won't work. Now, the next reason is the official reason why Nintendo said they did not want to do gaming consoles with CDs, and that is the loading screens. Now, young viewers who are, listening, watching this or whatever, you may think, oh, what's the big deal with loading screens? Loading bars? They don't stick around for long. Well, that's incorrect. Back then, you had to wait. You had to wait a while. Some games, they went faster than others. You could be waiting anywhere from 30 seconds to 4 or 5 minutes. Now, I know you're thinking, yeah, you wait a few minutes, it loads up. Who cares? Well, firstly, Nintendo cared. They believed that gamers would not put up with such a thing. You boot up your system, you go to your game, it's meant to load up straight away, it's not meant to be a wait. Now, the issue with this is some games, because CDs could push the boundaries so much, some games had huge loading times. And frustratingly enough, some games even reloaded every time you died. So imagine you're playing some epic RPG or whatever. You're up to a boss. This boss keeps killing you, within 10-20 seconds. You would then have to wait again for that loading bar. You see what I mean? So all of a sudden, that 3-4 minute wait, which you didn't care about a moment ago, knowing that you're going to have to face it every time you die, every time you go into another area, it adds up. It was really frustrating. That's something which naturally came from CDs. It wasn't a mistake on Sony's behalf. This is how CDs worked. Okay, well, that's all the negatives from the PlayStation. So we've spoken about the good things for the Sony PlayStation, which there was absolutely heaps. The CD was a good decision. And we've spoken about the negatives, mainly the vulnerability of the system. Memory cards corrupting, CDs getting scratched, load-in bars, and having to buy that attachment for the multiplayer. Now, let's leave the Sony PlayStation alone. Let's have a look at the Nintendo 64, the other competition during that era. Keep in mind, people, that during this time, it was just those two consoles competing against each other. The Xbox didn't exist yet. Alright, so let's have a look at Nintendo's first 3D console, the Nintendo 64. Oh, and one more negative thing I forgot to mention about the Sony PlayStation console is that it was a 32-bit system. So the 32-bit was the processing power. That was the processor. It was a 32-bit processor. Obviously, the negative here is, you can tell by the Nintendo 64's name, is the 64 was to do with the processor. The PlayStation had a 32-bit processor. The Nintendo 64 had a 64-bit processor. So obviously Nintendo had double the power in that area. Okay, so let's have a look at the positive things for the Nintendo 64. Firstly, was how the actual console itself was built. Right off the bat, the Nintendo 64 had 4 controller ports, which meant that straight away it supported 4 players without having to buy any attachments. Another advantage which the Nintendo 64 had, was how you saved the game data. You did not have to buy memory cards, which meant that you didn't have to worry about corrupted memory cards or having to buy any more. You just went in. The other advantage, which I mentioned just a moment ago, is the fact that it was a 64-bit system and Sony's was the 32-bit. So this automatically meant, for those of you that weren't aware or are not aware, the Nintendo 64 was actually graphically the superior system. It did have limitations, which we'll discuss, but all in all, it was the stronger PC. Now, the 64 also virtually had no loading times. If you ever saw it, it would be literally a few seconds, if that. For the most part, you'd play games and you'd be convinced that there was no loading. And as I mentioned previously, this was the reason why Nintendo did not want to do the CD thing. They had the option, they did their research, they were a big successful company coming off the success of the Super Nintendo. When they heard that CDs had loading times, they honestly believed, and I'm sure they were shocked that people accepted it with the Sony PlayStation, they honestly believed that the consumer would refuse to put up with these loading times. So they went with a cartridge, so then you and me don't have to deal with the loading time, which is very much appreciated. It meant when I booted up the system, it went into the game very fast. There was no loading, and if I died, it didn't matter, it loaded right back up. I wasn't greedy with the loading screen. Okay, so another advantage, and this goes without saying, is the exclusive Nintendo IPs. So Mario 64, Zelda, and so forth. I'm not really going to go on about the exclusive IPs, because Nintendo 64 had great Nintendo games. The PlayStation had even more good games. Although, yeah, so both sides had great games. But obviously, yeah, it is a console-related thing. You're not going to see Mario on any other on any other console. Now, the Nintendo 64's graphics chip was capable of trilinear filtering, which allowed textures to look very smooth. Sony used an inferior filter. Now, basically what this means is objects, think about AA. So, what is it, anti-aliasing? Yeah, I think that's the word. Basically, there were less jaggers. Things stood out nicer. Objects look smoother. Textures look smoother. Things just looked better because of this filtering method. So those of you that have PCs, and when you go to a game's graphic settings, you have all these filtering options. To make it very simple, the Nintendo 64 had the better filtering option. It was the higher one. Now, I've discussed the benefits of the Nintendo 64, so just to recap, you could play 4-player straight off the bat without any attachment. You could save the data without a memory card, so you didn't have to worry about, again, forking out more money and worrying about a corrupted card. You had little to no loading screens. You had a graphically superior system, and you had Nintendo's IPs. Now, that's enough good stuff. Fair's fair. Let's have a look at the cons that the Nintendo 64 brought to the table. Now, ironically, the cons of the Nintendo 64 are mixed up with the pros of the Nintendo 64. A lot of the pro points the Nintendo 64 got was because of the advantages that the cartridge gave over CDs, such as loading time and so forth. Now, unfortunately, the cartridge is also the problem with the Nintendo 64. You see, cartridges are much smaller in size. Your typical CD was about 700 megabytes. A Nintendo 64 cartridge, pushed to its largest, because you had different versions of it, would be 64 megabytes. So, let that sink in for a while. 64 was the max. 700 for the CD. 64, 700. Alright, so this is where developers obviously had a problem with it, and this is why Nintendo couldn't have as high quality audio. When you have a game console, you want to attract as many developers as possible. Now, there's quite a few easy ways to do that. One, you have a gaming platform that has a large user base. Two, it's not too hard to program for. Three, the less effort they need to put into it, the better, because they're there to make money. It isn't about keeping the gamer happy, it's a business, people. Now, cartridges were more expensive. A lot more expensive. You had to predict sales as well and make sure that you had enough cartridges made to meet the demand. Unsuccessful games would often have a lot of cartridges made only to sit there and collect dust. It was a slower process, and a lot more work had to be put into Nintendo 64 games, as it had to be compressed. So developers would first make a game, make it the way they want, then they would have to compress every single aspect: the audio, the textures, the graphics, and so forth and so forth. This put off a lot of developers, the famous example it being Final Fantasy VII. The Final Fantasy games previously were on the Nintendo and Super Nintendo consoles. It was a Nintendo thing. Now, they didn't like the Nintendo 64. Final Fantasy VII, if I remember correctly, came on 4 CDs, I believe. 4, maybe 5, maybe even more. It was a whole bunch of CDs because they had very high quality audio and they had large, fully 3D rendered cinematics. Now, you need a lot of space for that. The Nintendo 64 cartridge couldn't cut it, unfortunately. So there you have it. The PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 pitted against each other. Let's quickly summarize and let me know below in the comments which console you actually think was the best. So the PlayStation had the advantage of the CD, extra room, more games, great games, heaps of them. And yeah, it was just a really fun console that brought countless classics. It was a lot of fun to play. The Nintendo 64 had games come out at a much, much slower pace, but they were of quality. It's mostly a case of less is more, but the thing is, it was less. Like for every 20 or even 30 games, I'm not exaggerating, for every 20-30 PlayStation games you got, at the same time you would have one new Nintendo 64 game. So, you know, the games came at a slower rate, but it was a superior console. No load times, you know, multiplayer straight off the bat, save things without a memory card. Yay or nay, I don't actually have a favorite between these two systems. I loved both of them. Both of them gave me excellent games. But yeah, I wanted to just pit these two consoles together in a bit of a retro series. Next in line, I'll have a look at the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and the Xbox. The original Xbox, I want to say Xbox One, but then that brings us to the current Xbox. Why, Microsoft, did you name your new console Xbox One? Like, you didn't think that would confuse anyone. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys. You've been watching Gamers Treehouse. Be sure to like and subscribe. Also, keep in mind, people, that we do have a channel on Daily Motion. It's under Gamers Treehouse 2013, and we also have a Facebook page, which whenever I release one of my fantastic videos, there's always a link on there. So if you're on Facebook often, as I am, and I'm sure most of you are, then yeah, you know, you'll be notified. So go like the page, and whenever a new video comes out, you'll be notified. So yeah, anyways, guys, thanks for your time, and until next time, I should say, have a good one. I'm going to excuse myself from slurring. I think I need a coffee.